Hello. Welcome. Welcome. Well, on behalf of the Mauro Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College, University of Manitoba, welcome. And a very good evening to each and every one of you. My name is Dr. Stanley Amolidis, and I'm the director for the Mauro Institute. The vision of our institute is to be a beacon for transformative change through the lenses of the Abrahamic traditions for the sake of human dignity, rational discourse, peace, and social justice. Before I continue, allow me to acknowledge the land upon which we stand or sit. And I quote, "The University of Manitoba campuses and research spaces are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininiwak, Sinnisiwak, Dakota, Ayote, Dene, Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration." Unquote. This forum and dialogue, the first of two this fall, is funded by the Hersh and Arna Shefrin Dialogues on Peace and Conflict. Now, the purpose of this fund is to establish a series of dialogues by inviting two or more high-level speakers with different views on a specific topic, related, of course, to peace and conflict. A little bit about Anna and Dr. Hersh. Arna Shefrin received the Alumni of Distinction Award by the U of M School of Dental Hygiene Alumni Association in 2016. Arna Shefrin became the first North American trained dental hygienist to be licensed to practice in the United Kingdom. She was also the first dental hygienist to have an article published in the Journal of Dental Education. Dr. Harold Shefrin, he calls himself Hersh, received the University of Manitoba Distinguished Alumni Award for Lifetime Achievement in 2019. A pioneer in behavioral finance, Dr. Shefrin holds the Mario Bellotti Chair in the Department of Finance at Santa Clara University, Levi School of Business. Now, we're not only honored to host this evening's dialogue, but also pleased to acknowledge the long-standing relationship between the University of Trier and the University of Manitoba. The conference program for this, Resisting the Perceived Limits of Dialogue, will be made available to you at the reception. And if you're interested in attending this conference, you're welcome. It's free, there's no registration required, and it's open to all of you, Thursday and Friday. One last paragraph. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator for this evening's dialogue, Dr. Andrea Sharon. Now, Dr. Sharon holds a PhD from the Royal Military College of Canada, Department of War Studies. She's the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies and professor of international relations here at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Shefrin worked for various federal departments, including the Canadian Privy Council Office, in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat, before beginning her academic career. She writes extensively on Arctic security, NATO, NORAD, and Canadian defense policy. She is a co-author of NORAD in Perpetuity and Beyond, also a co-editor of The Legacy of 9/11, Views from North America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Arna Shefrin.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank everybody for coming, and it's always great to see so many students here. I think it's these kind of occasions for dialogue when we really do our best learning. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Colin Robertson, who is our keynote speaker today. His keynote is entitled In Defense of Dialogue, Diplomacy in a Dangerous World. Colin Robertson is a former diplomat. He is the vice president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a host of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute's weekly Global Exchange podcast. You've probably heard him on many occasions on CBC radio as a commentator. He takes very complicated topics and is able to put it into perspective for all of us. He was on the negotiating team for Canada for both the Canada-US and NAFTA agreements. He served at Canada's UN mission, at the Consulate General in New York, the Council in Hong Kong, the Consul General in Los Angeles, and was the first head of the Washington Embassy Advocacy Secretariat in Washington. He's received the Mexican Order of the Aztec Eagle, both Alberta and Saskatchewan's Centennial Medals, the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee, and the King Charles III Coronation Medals. And if that's not enough, he has also received the Canadian Forces Decoration. It's my distinct honor to present to you Mr. Colin Robertson.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, and Stanley, thank you very much for making this possible. The Arthur Mauro Institute and the Shefrin family, I pay tribute to them because I think, as you will probably hear in my remarks, if there is one single theme I want to, it's the importance of dialogue, and face-to-face dialogue in particular, because without it, we really are lost. Balance my water here and hope that doesn't fall off. All right. Well, I am, as I say, pleased to be here, and I think that this is an important subject because as I lead off, dialogue is to diplomacy what force of arms is to deterrence. Let's see. There we go. Get the computer going. Foreign ministries praise and practice dialogue. Summits revel in it, if you read any summit things, and communiques promise much more of dialogue. Yet dialogue, arguably, I would say, matters more today than at any time in recent memory, as the international situation, and you just have to look at the news, deteriorates. The guardrails of the post-war rules-based order, which I grew up in, once underwritten by the United States, their might and leadership, are no longer guaranteed. And this is singular, particularly to Donald Trump, obviously. Instability in a newly multipolar world is dangerous. The threats we face, and I'll name some: proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, climate change, pandemics, rogue actors, and cybercrime. They are exacerbated by artificial intelligence and quantum technology. Canada is not fireproof, literally or figuratively. Mitigating these risks requires diplomatic dialogue grounded in strategy and backed by credible deterrence. When dialogue breaks down, alternatives escalate from sanctions to severed relations to outright war. Just look at Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and Myanmar. Without dialogue, people die. Dialogue comes in many forms. There's the traditional closed-door diplomacy, like Canada is currently trying to do now, efforts to stabilize our relations with China and with India through ambassadorial meetings and through ministerial visits. And we deal with things like trade disputes and human rights. And that's how we do it behind closed doors. There's public diplomacy where culture builds connections. And arguably what Donald Trump is doing today in London is a form of cultural diplomacy. And I think the Royals are certainly earning their pay today. Think of Chantal Kravaziak from Winnipeg singing with Paul Anka and David Foster at the Getty during the Team Canada mission in late 2001 when I was there. And we were there to sort of remind post 9/11 Americans of our solidarity. So again, this was the kind of thing to use cultural diplomacy to work. Or as I had also experienced when I was in New York, the Royal Winnipeg Ballet and the Winnipeg Symphony coming while Canadian diplomats hosted key contacts over Crown Royal, which of course, water, as they told me later when I was in Los Angeles, comes from Lake Winnipeg. So we let the artistic excellence speak for national character. Track 1.5 dialogues is another form of diplomacy. And these are gatherings of officials and non-governmental organizations. And they get together and you sort of come up with ideas ahead of summits, especially apply this to things like climate and social policy. Then there's track 2 diplomacy, which consists of former officials, business people, academics. We exchange views off the record. I participated in such discussions with the Chinese, important today, as hosted, in my case, by the University of Alberta, the China Institute. Again, the role that universities play in doing these things really is important. These dialogues all rely on trust and intellectual honesty. As former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz used to tell me, trust is the coin of the realm. Without it, dialogue risks becoming an exercise in polite futility. Effective dialogue depends on strategy. You must know your ask, your red lines, and your interests. For middle powers like Canada, this means pursuing a strategy of prudence, pragmatism, and perseverance. What do I mean? Well, prudence demands careful, historically informed judgment. It means resisting overreaction and recognizing, in Donald Rumsfeld's famous words, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. Quiet diplomacy, once Canada's hallmark, requires such prudence. Let me illustrate where prudence was lacking as an example. When President Obama rejected the Keystone XL pipeline, the Harper government declared it a litmus test of Canada-US relations. Ministers blitzed American cities, and the result of all this was that Obama, for whom climate really was important, and this was a litmus test for his supporters, he dug in. The relationship chilled. We have 70 pipelines that currently cross our border, and making one the litmus test, I think, was unwise because you stake the whole bilateral relationship, as I say, on this one project. Or the case of Meng Wanzhou. Again, you'll remember, Canada detained her at U.S. request, and China responded by seizing the two Michaels hostage for over 1,000 days. Former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley, who I worked for, later suggested we might have shown some, as he put it, creative incompetence at the airport, probably more prudent case. And I mention this because yesterday I met with the Chinese, working on a project with a number of others on how we get the Canada-US relationship back on track. And the China relationship plays a big role in it. So we met with the Chinese embassy, and the Meng Wanzhou affair has really stuck home with them. And they said to me, well, of course, when Meng Wanzhou was seized, you did it simply because the Americans asked. And I said, well, it's more complicated than that. They said, no, because Xi Jinping was at a conference with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump took great pleasure in turning to Xi Jinping and saying, when we've just taken Meng Wanzhou, who in Chinese terms is their equivalent of a crown princess. And again, it was more complicated than that, but it goes to show, again, the long-term effect of something like this and why the Chinese reacted the way they did. So again, I think prudence would have suggested we be more aware of what was going on. Prudence also means avoiding reckless interventions. Brian Mulroney insisted the Gulf War have UN authorization, and to his credit, George H.W. Bush followed his advice. George W. Bush didn't get such approval for Iraq. Jean Chrétien kept Canada out, telling the House of Commons, Canada will not engage in a war of choice. He was correct. The weapons of mass destruction that were mooted were never found. Sometimes diplomacy means saying no. Contrast that with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who rose in the House of Commons to accuse the Indian government of involvement in an assassination on Canadian soil. Probably true, but still not yet proven. Trudeau got headlines, but not results. Ambassadors were expelled, visas suspended, and relations with India froze. So, upending Trudeau's Indo-Pacific strategy. Only now are relations resuming. Pragmatism means knowing what's possible, what can be parked, and what's worth giving up, when to hold and when to fold, when letting the perfect become the enemy of the good, to avoid that, and remembering that patience is a virtue. After 9/11, John Manley and U.S. Homeland Security Chief Tom Ridge quietly but quickly negotiated the Smart Border Accord that balanced trade and security. Mexico wanted in, but Manley said no because the borders were fundamentally different. Having been to the southern border, it is. It's drugs, it's guns, and people crossing, whereas ours, of course, is a much wider border, but fundamentally different. Manley and Ridge agreed on goals, and interestingly enough, shared their briefing books. They insisted the officials give them the same briefing book, so they were actually speaking from the same thing. And we used online dashboards. The internet had just come in to track results, and that also acted as a prod to keep the civil servants moving forward. Their approach turned our shared border into a real asset. Manley was right to say, security and prosperity are two sides of the same coin. Or consider our recent digital services tax. Ontario opposed it, but we forged ahead anyway, and we got further ahead than the European Union, then stopped implementation under Mr. Carney to keep current trade talks with the United States alive. Again, I think the right decision. Remember, we do like $3 billion worth of trade a year, and we were going to collect something like $22 billion, which would have been about 8 days, but Trump had put the whole trade talks, which were still ongoing now, at risk, and so we lifted, and I think, again, an example of pragmatism. Canada's access to the U.S. market is vital for every province. Every province trades more with the United States than they do with anybody else. Overall, it's 75% of our trade. The Auto Pact, our original free trade deal, as an example, employs 500,000 people. 2/3 of our economy is tied to trade. For Canada, trade policy is national policy, which is why we're spending so much time on it right now. Prime Minister Mark Carney is now reviving industrial strategy in partnership with the premiers, First Nations, business, and civil society. I think it's long overdue. Perseverance is the third sort of element, I think, that goes into good strategy. It's crucial for a middle power like Canada, because we're usually on the receiving end of great power actions, either directly or, as often the case with Canada in the United States, as collateral damage. Canada must set long-term goals and stick to them, even through transitions in government. To be successful, national security and defense policies must enjoy the continuity of cross-aisle support. And by that, I mean basically conservatives and liberals have to agree on vital things like defense and security policy, so there is that continuity. Pierre Trudeau's 1983 peace initiative, which I worked on, called for nuclear restraint during the Cold War. It was at a time when we heard about the evil empire and Ronald Reagan was the president. He lacked leverage, but he showed moral leadership. And I do think at the end of the day, even Ronald Reagan admitted it, who actually quietly encouraged Trudeau, even if the Pentagon was against it. But as Trudeau put it, he was at the end of his, 15 years as prime minister, but is touched in part because he had 3 sons. We must not, as he put it, we must not merely be on the side of peace, Trudeau said, but be prepared to work for it. More impactful was Lloyd Axworthy. Of course, Lloyd Axworthy from here is, when he became foreign minister, his human security agenda, the Landmines Treaty, the Child Soldiers Convention, and the International Criminal Court, which over the space of a dozen years all came into effect. Axworthy's vision succeeded, even though he left office, because he persevered, and so did Canada. And we did so with a broad support of a network that included, critically, the U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Mexican Foreign Minister Rosario Green. And a lot of our European allies were on site as well. Critically, he also enjoyed the full backing of Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Brian Mulroney and Joe Clark showed similar perseverance in opposing apartheid. Mulroney stood firm even against his friend Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Nelson Mandela later came to Canada and thanked us for what he called our steadfastness and said that our respect for diversity was a model for South Africans. Middle powers like Canada cannot coerce, but we can convene. We can broker as a helpful fixer. And we must contribute to collective deterrence, which we are now doing. Today's world is fragmenting into spheres of influence. Canada needs both dialogue and deterrence to deal with all of this. I think the Carney government's pledge to hit NATO's 2% defense commitment this year and 5% over the next decade puts the national interest first and is necessary, again, because of the changed environment, not where we choose to put our money, but where we need to put our money. So does a major rethink and reinvestment in how we do diplomacy, including reforming development assistance to put the emphasis on technical assistance that will also serve our trade interests. The lesson of Pearsonian diplomacy is that credibility requires hard power. After World War II, Canada had the world's, and keep this in mind, we had the 4th largest Navy and Air Force. We did the training, of course, here in Winnipeg, the Commonwealth Air System that worked very well. And it earned us a seat at the table because we had put the funding into and we had put the troops on the battlefield and in the air and on the seas. And so we played a real role in the design of post-war rules-based multilateral institutions. And if the Americans were the architects, we were the engineers. Jeffrey Pearson, who was the son of Lester Pearson, who later won the Nobel Peace Prize, the only Canadian to win one. Jeffrey was my first big boss when I joined the Foreign Service, and he reminded me that diplomacy requires timing, experience, and personality. His father had all three. His father demonstrated, as I say, these three in his belief that diplomacy meant, as Lester Pearson put it, or Mike Pearson as we know him, letting the other guy have your way. He and his colleagues, Escott Reed, Hume Wrong, Norman Robertson, devised a strategic framework for Canada, a doctrine for Canada, which they called functionalism. Functionalism means that if you have interests and competence, you earn a seat at the table. It anchored then Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent's 1947 Gray Lecture. Actually, he was Foreign Minister at the time, but became Prime Minister the next year, which outlined 5 enduring Canadian foreign policy principles. The first principle was national unity, which of course still applies in our country, political liberty, the rule of law, human values, which obviously the Mauros and the Shefrins would certainly represent, and international responsibility. It's time for, in my view, to restore functionalism as our North Star for foreign policy. I do believe Prime Minister Carney gets this. As he put it, a new imperialism threatens. Middle powers compete for interest and attention, knowing that if they are not at the table, they will be on the menu. To be at the table, Canada needs world-class diplomacy and credible deterrence. Neither is currently adequate. We're starting to rebuild our military capacity. Now we must reinvest in diplomacy and especially in development assistance that can respond to our changing geopolitical and socioeconomic circumstance. Functionalism can guide our engagement in areas where interests and competence intersect. I'll give you some examples. Energy and critical minerals, pretty obvious. Agri-food, water, pluralism. And the North. We possess critical minerals. We have oil and gas to help our allies in the transition to renewable energies. We have uranium and the knowledge to develop small modular nuclear reactors. We led on food security after World War II. Pearson helped create and found the Food and Agriculture Organization, and we are a model, albeit imperfect, for pluralism. And we must get serious certainly Andrea would endorse this, about the Arctic, our sovereignty, our environment, our security. But there's another danger, and that's to dialogue itself. Political polarization, algorithmic social media, and culture wars have narrowed our capacity to talk to those who disagree with us, or to disaggregate fact from feeling, truth from fiction, in a digital world where disinformation and misinformation are just a click away. While digital technologies connect, they also inflame. Social platforms reward outrage over understanding. As Cass Sunstein warns, algorithms drive fragmentation and polarization. In a world of memes, TikTok, and slogans, nuance disappears. Minor disagreements are recast as moral failures. Yasha Monk argues culture wars now frame policy differences as existential threats. Even families in classrooms avoid tough conversations. That's not how things should work. Robert Putnam warned of this civic decline in Bowling Alone, a warning I think is more urgent than ever before. And again, without dialogue, democracy decays, and I worry that that's what we're facing. Canada's diplomatic history proves that middle powers can help shape our world, but only if they show up with ideas, credibility, and coalition partners. We need prudence, pragmatism, and perseverance, plus a dose of humility and willingness to listen. It's not virtue signaling or preaching. Again, to repeat Lester Pearson, diplomacy is letting the other guy have your way. To do that, we must be in the room, ready to talk, ready with solutions, and ready to act. So let's not just cheer for the rules-based order, let's work for it with purpose, with patience, and with perseverance. Thank you. Now we're going to go to the...
We're going to go up there. So I want to please thank you for acknowledging Colin Robertson. We're now going to have a bit of a panel discussion, and this is an opportunity as well for you, the audience, to ask the panel members, whom I will invite onto the stage, please, and then I will introduce them. But think about your questions to them, because we want this to be an exchange, a real dialogue. So I'll get the panelists to come up to the stage and have a seat.
Where do you want us to sit?
Wherever you want. You've got these big couches. I will take this one too. I will sit at the end, 'cause I'm not the focus. I'll sit over here.
Let's wait.
Okay, so I'll briefly introduce our panelists. I'll start with Dr. Jim Ferguson, who many people in this room know. He recently retired professor and my partner in crime for many, many years. He's now a senior scholar at the Center for Defense and Security Studies. He and I have spent decade plus co-authoring many reports and chapters and things like that, but he really is one of Canada's foremost defense policy experts. We've met Colin Robertson. We then have Manuel Froelich from Trier University. He holds the chair of international relations and foreign policy there. And at Trier, he established the interdisciplinary master's program in international relations and diplomacy, which I think is really relevant for our discussion about dialogue today. We then have Dr. Stephen Yeager. He is a professor of Germanic studies here at the University of Manitoba. He conducts research on narratives and memory, war, genocide, and violence. And he's been the co-editor of of a book series on museums and narrative, and has several manuscripts that sort of look at the Second World War and then how it's played back to us. And finally, we have Ursula Lemkuhl, and she is an expert in international history and area studies with an emphasis on North America, so really interesting to get a German's perspective on how we see ourselves. She's keenly interested in the cultural approach to diplomatic history. She's been the lead spokesperson for International Research Training Group on diversity, mediating differences in transcultural spaces, which is also really relevant here. So maybe I can just open it up. In Colin Robertson's discussion, it brought to mind the fact that if we're going to have dialogue, especially if we're dealing with really intractable conflicts, that we have to sort of channel Theodore Roosevelt, that it has to be speaking softly but having a big stick. Maybe I could just ask all of you, and I'll start with Jim, is it possible today to have dialogue in Canada when we are becoming quite polarized, when we're quite influenced by events outside of North America? So Jim, I'll start with you and we'll go down the line.
Thanks, Andrew, I think. The answer, like everything from an academic, is always yes and no. Despite what we have seen since the election of Donald Trump, the various statements that have come out of Trump's tweets, et cetera, with regards to Canada, the 51st state, the tariff issue, the Canadian response, and really it was in place long before he started yakking, and that's what I like to say. He started yakking that there was a great deal of unease. Trump was unpopular in Canada before he became president for the second time. We didn't like him. This created or generated, at least if you look at it at the public domain, a response of what I would call near virulent nationalism, a very negative response. But ironically, it didn't really have a political impact on dialogue between the two countries. You look at the record, the Prime Minister, Trudeau, then Carney, down to the United States, talking to Trump. Cabinet officials, regularly, to this day, provincial officials, provincial representatives, constantly going down to the United States to talk to the Americans, to try to lobby various elements that have different roles and functions within the US Constitution to try to influence American policy. So you would think that public nationalism, to be blunt, we hate Trump, would have a major impact on the government's ability to enter into dialogue with the United States and its various officials. The answer was no. We continued, and it's an interesting little problem or phenomena, it seems to me. How would that be placed, given that, I'll go back to Mike Pearson's famous statement, foreign policy is domestic politics with its hat on, the drive of domestic politics. The real element, the danger of dialogue, and it has driven certain elements of Canadian policy, and hopefully we'll get into them, where I disagree with Colin about several elements, where it is the dangerous underlying element that affects and constrains Canadian negotiations, Canadian dialogue, is twofold. One is, how does the United States officials perceive us, what we're doing and what we're saying to them? What impact does it truly have? And remember that although we talk a lot about executive to executive relations and give examples of prime ministers to presidents, et cetera, even in those periods over time of chilled relations, the overall Canada-US relations has continued to churn along fine with dialogue at secondary and lower levels of relations. But the second element of this, in my mind, and I'll end here, is the public. Part of dialogue is not just executive to executive, bureaucrat to bureaucrat, industry to industry, labor to labor. Part of the importance of dialogue, in this case between Canada and the United States, is people to people. And that's what's happened to the bad, if you want to put it this way. Canadian tourism to the United States has dropped dramatically. And this is only anecdotal, but I can tell you I've talked to a lot of people I know from the left side to the right side of the political spectrum, and they tell me, I'm not going to the United States. This is Donald Trump. I'm not talking to Americans. I'm not going to go to the United States. And I asked them, well, why not? What's changed between relationship between people and people? And if you lose that part, the quiet part we never pay attention to, you lose that part, and it continues over time, this is eventually going to spill up the chain that's going to affect dialogue. Because in democratic societies, the people, the public, talk to the political leaders, the bureaucrats, they all listen to them. And the more you get this negative sense between the two societies, not a polarization right and left in the case of Canada and the United States internally, but an increasing polarization between Canada and the United States publicly, it's going to start to undermine the senior political levels. And that will be deeply problematic for our relationship with the United States, as it is for our relationship with any other liberal democratic society.
Thanks. I'm going to skip over Colin, but Colin, I'll give you a chance to for your rebuttal. But Manuel, you're a specialty in diplomacy. From your perspective, what do we need to have effective diplomacy? Because we seem to be really struggling, and maybe it's a different perspective from Europe.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's we are witnessing a real challenge not only to individual or bilateral relations, but to the institution of diplomacy itself. Because with Donald Trump, diplomacy got highly transactional, but also highly personalized. And in Europe, you would see that all the foreign ministries would have expert staff trying to organize rehearsals for what can happen in the White House when you sit besides the president. And so the trying to take care of the overall and also emotional surrounding of the leader of that country has become a preeminent occupation of foreign offices worldwide. There were times, and diplomacy oftentimes is highly personal, but I think we can discern some differences. If you, for example, remember the last time European leaders, together with the NATO Secretary General, went to the White House and tried to follow up on the Alaska summit and try to bring to the table, as it were, the Ukrainian perspective on things. Then this was something of a sort of choreography of trying to dispel certain conceptions and misconceptions of what was happening. And they obviously employed a division of labor of who would talk about what and when. And this, in a way, was similar to the cabinet meetings that we have in the United States by now, which is, and this is once again partly legitimate, but it has become some sort of a entertainment showbiz-like diplomacy, where you would need the picture and the dynamic of the people interacting. And although I think that courtesy and flattery have been principal tools of diplomacy since the ages, it is probably difficult and not sustainable to speak as if in diplomacy and try to address things that probably are a little bit removed from the subject matter at hand. So I would say that trying to work on trying to not lose sight of the essentials of diplomacy is going to be a central task ahead for many countries, and in that I would very much like to support what Colin Robertson said on the essential and constitutive role that trust and, if I may say, genuine dialogue, to use a phrase of Martin Buber, genuine dialogue will have to play in diplomacy, because this very, some say it's not a technique but an art form, but diplomacy needs this kind of genuine dialogue like oxygen. Otherwise it's only a stage performance that doesn't bring any added value really to the transactional, economic and military things that you can muster. And I think this is the challenge and also the task, especially for European leaders, and I would see Canada in probably a similar position, to not lose sight of these things, and also to, well, at times then stand up for what they think is right and remains right. And we have seen that even the disadvantages of putting things in a direct form probably are also not very much sustainable. And then, if I may add, one of the things that we know from political psychology studies in international relations, probably leadership trait analysis of the American president, he's open to information. This is one of the characteristics that is being investigated by means of quantitative at a distance techniques. And this, at the same time, is also a chance for diplomacy, because with Donald Trump, few things are settled in that way, and that still is the chance also for other perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they often say with President Trump, it's the last person who has access to him that then can influence things. Stefan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm here feeling a little bit like an outsider because I'm the only one who is really not doing political science or at least political history. So I come much more from a cultural perspective. I mean, I agree with a lot that was said for the need for prudence, pragmatism. I think we can see that. We can see that also in the cultural sector. I mean, one example to give you where, I mean, since I do museum studies, I mean, right now, museums obviously in the US are struggling in a way to relate to the policies they are getting in a way, and how, or can they be independent institutions? How can they kind of still show multiple perspectives? I mean, that has nothing to do with Canada, but it shows you exactly what Colin was talking about. And one example is the kind of museum of the Jewish Museum of the Holocaust in New York, which had an exhibition where direct speech by Donald Trump was used for as an expression of anti-Semitism. And I would also say, I mean, the exhibition came from Houston, but it doesn't change the fact that it's not very prudent, and the result was very expectable. Long before anybody from the Trump administration complained about it, the museum board forced its own museum to basically change the exhibition, which created then a scandal in the museum world. And I think you could do a smarter discussion of anti-Semitism that actually leads to a real discussion what it is, how certain parts of society, including the Trump administration, in a way relate to it or use it in a way, and you don't do that by basically hitting it straight on. So I think, and we see that in the cultural sector too. Where I'm starting a little bit be skeptical though is in a way from a cultural perspective. I mean, one example I looked up where Canada clearly followed or caved in to American pressure in the past was in the 1950s and 60s regarding the kind of bearing from queer people, or they called it homosexuals at the time, so gay people who kind of were working in government offices, particularly for the National Security Service, and that was with a lot of American pressure. Of course, now we could debate, and the interesting question I had on this for the whole panel of political scientists is, okay, did they cave because the values in Canada at that time were similar enough that the caving wasn't a big moral kind of problem in a way? Or did they cave, which would be potentially a problem, because then we would do much more. Then it's much more than prudency. We would potentially lose all the value systems in a way we have, or the morality we stand up to. And I think that's something, if one wants to connect it in a way, what Canada stands for, yeah, I mean, how do we deal with problems like that? And last thought, the question here is, again, if we talk about prudence and pragmatism and perseverance, how do we deal with the fact that many, I mean, I think, yeah, we already talked about, on the one hand, there's diplomacy, on the other hand, there are the people. But how do we deal with the problem that so much is kind of globalized, and the kind of the increasing kind of polarization is, first of all, not just a Donald Trump or US-Canada phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon in a way. It is a global discourse in a way. The discourse is on Gaza and Israel in a way, and the lack of dialogue that where you almost are forced to take either side because you can't find a middle ground anymore. That has something to do with the global phenomenon, and that's what we have to somehow tackle if we want to, if we want to have dialogue. So I think I'm a bit skeptical. Can we really restrict it to state actors, Canada or the US, whether it's on the high level or on the lower level, or do we have to tackle it deeper in society?
Ursula.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Colin, for your talk. I really like the picture that you painted of how diplomacy, dialogue, the political system of exchange functions, and how Canada situated itself and what Canada needs, this trio of prudence, pragmatism, and perseverance. If we look at the situation that we see and we are confronted with, and Manuel talked a little bit about it, and also Jim, how politics, how diplomacy unfolds today. The picture of, people sitting in the White House having rehearsed that and being afraid of, what is going to happen there. And do I survive this situation politically? That shows us, I think, that the current situation of how we can rely on the basic elements that have been established since 1945 in order to secure diplomacy and dialogue, namely to have a rational dialogue, to have, a rational way of communicative action, to use Habermas's word, to have, pragmatic approaches. We see today that we are faced with idiosyncrasies. The perseverance is confronted with unpredictable, non-strategic forms of action. So I think the situation today is confronted with a basic challenge, or a challenge regarding the basics of diplomacy as it has been, as it has developed over centuries. And the basics are routines, protocols, and trust. And you know how things unfold if you do certain things. You know how, a summit meeting unfolds because you have a certain protocol. All these things are no longer true. Look at the Munich Security Conference. Vance coming up there and doing something. There was completely, beyond established protocols. So I think if we take this as a first point into account, I think we need to talk about how can we reestablish, how can we work in, our partnerships to reestablish these basics of diplomacy, even if we have a partner who is not, sticking to this. What makes the situation more complicated from my point of view is the thing that Jim was mentioning. So we have a populace, not only in the United States, but I also see it in Canada, I see it in Germany and in many other European countries, that is heavily split along populist, fractions. They live in very different and somehow sealed off echo chambers. They don't talk to each other. Conversation even, among family members that, belong to different populist strands is not taking place. And that's a second level where I see, a major problem of, reestablishing a political, action or political activities that go back to the normal, so to speak, if, those people who elect the politicians are acting on a complete different way as they might have done in 45 when Canada was sitting at the table, was a middle power, was pleading for functionalism. And all these people that you've mentioned, Colin, Escott Reed and so on, I've worked with those, because my first book, published ages ago in 1990, was exactly, on this diplomatic North Atlantic Triangle diplomacy. So I see these major 2 points. So we have a populist split, we have on the political level politicians who do not act according to the well-established rules of diplomacy. And we won't solve that with a big stick. We need, I think, a strategy to re-establish political legitimacy of cooperation, of collaboration, and that also has to talk to our own people. Because this renationalization that we see, the upcoming nationalist and populist movements, they all go against collaborative, strands.
Thanks, Ursula. I'm going to turn it back to Colin. Keeping in mind what Ursula said, you helped to negotiate the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the first NAFTA agreement. We're all worried about what's going to happen with the next round of negotiations. And of course, Germany is going to be part of negotiations with US, if only to get rid of the tariffs. What is your advice to Prime Minister Carney, to the German Chancellor? Like, what happened when you were negotiating these deals that may still be present now or is definitely needed? And you've got a microphone right on your right hand there.
Well, thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Ursula. And well, I guess the single biggest change is you're dealing with Donald Trump, who is unpredictable and chaotic, and we've never had a president or a leader of a democracy like him, and he's in a position of power, and he's broken all the norms and rules that we all, whether you're Republican or Democrat, lived by for so long. And it didn't matter, we had changes of government. And so that's the biggest shift from when we were negotiating with the Americans before. We sat down, and there was, you were talking about the importance of structure. And these are structures that go back over time, because this was how civilized behavior worked. Which takes me to one person I got to know when I was in Washington and then would go and see at Stanford, and recently did a podcast with, is Frank Fukuyama, the famous End of History, which was that democracy would eventually triumph because it gave people the opportunity to realize themselves and also provide progress. So Stefan, when you talked about homosexuality in the foreign, and I'm conscious of it because the Foreign Service, it was an issue and people I had great respect for it got bummed out. I don't think the Americans drove it. I think it was prevailing cultural trends in Canada as well. But this is a great thing that has changed, and then it's changed in the span of our lifetime. And these were otherwise prevailing cultural taboos that they've endured for centuries. But what we've seen, remarkable progress on the one hand, but on the other hand, we meet back to where we are, and I really do worry about democracy. And this was Frank Fukuyama's thing. He said that if it's what people really do want. He said that the lineups around the world to go places, or to go to the United States and to Canada and Australia and New Zealand, the countries that received immigrants, they weren't lined up to go to China or Russia or Saudi Arabia. They were, because this is what people aspired to, and part of it was cultural and everything else. But that maybe began to shift slightly. But we've just had this Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, and the Chinese are offering an alternate means of governance, which would come with surveillance culture and things. And some leaders that will appeal to, but I'm not sure I hope it doesn't work out that way, but it might. I mean, this is the dark side, is that if you look at world history, you realize that basically spheres of influence and autocracy and authoritarianism has been the prevailing trend for centuries. And really, it's only since the Second World War that we enjoyed this remarkable period in the West of democracy, having been through all these other things. And maybe we're going to lose it. And democracy will decay. And I do think that's something that so I don't know the happy ending, but I do know that if you don't get down and talk to people, and if you don't talk like we're talking tonight, face to face, I do think that's the way around. That is how diplomacy still works. I mentioned I sat down with the Chinese delegation yesterday, and they came, and it was civil. We were frank dialogue back and forth. They didn't like our approach. We'd come up with selective engagement. They thought it should be full engagement. We said, but you don't want to talk. You won't talk human rights. They said that's true. So, and what we have to sell to our people, if we're going to deal with you, it's going to be on trade, and it'll be in shared interests, climate, pandemics, things like that, where we have. So start off on what you can actually make progress on, and then hope to get to the tougher stuff later. So to go back to your original question about NAFTA, I'm working on this right now, and we are still at the table, and we have made concessions to stay at the table, and we do so because we have such significant interests. How it's going to work out, I don't know, but I do know that we have a lot of allies in the United States. And I do think that it's, the old Scottish proverb, a lie is halfway around the world before truth gets its boots on. I think that also applies to democracies versus autocracies. Autocracies have the advantage. And the United States is right now run by somebody who has all the behavioral attitudes of a fascist or an authoritarian. And that's tough for us because that's not what we're used to. And unfortunately, they are the major power. And they're using, and he is using the leverage of trade to extort concessions. I thought, for example, we took retaliatory tariffs against the Americans when they posed tariffs against us. We thought Mexico would come along. They chose not to. We thought the Europeans would, because we were thinking that if there were enough of us, this would have effect on American politicians, because remember, Trump only won by about 1-2%. So while we assume the United States has gone to the dark side, his ratings are still at 42%. He's not by any means in the 50s or anything. There's a lot of Americans that are unhappy with the way things are going. So I think you don't give up. So you stay at the table, you keep negotiating, and hope over time. And this is where I do think patience in diplomacy can work to your advantage, although we're not seeing the advantage just yet. And so, again, it's a story. I don't know how it's going to end. But then I'd say to you also, what's our alternative? Is it just to give in? I don't think so. I don't think that's what democracies do. And I do think what we're doing now, for example, to support Ukraine, and we're coming up to, we're basically coming to a coalition of the willing without the United States. And this would have been unheard of, and we wouldn't have not have thought of that 3 years ago, 2 years ago. But we are actually getting our act together there. We were talking earlier about how Germany's rearming. And so maybe that what comes out of this, I do think that arms do make a difference. I do think that is one thing that we forgot in Canada, that unfortunately the world is a difficult place. So your point, Jim, about do we speak softly, but we still have to carry that stick. And you can't just, we came to rely just on the United States. And so we all took the peace dividend and put it into social justice, but you can't have social justice if you haven't got the means to defend yourself, to preserve it. And that would be the great tragedy if that were to happen, because you'd be damn sure there's, when we talk of social justice, that's not what they practice in Russia or China or Trump's America.
So I don't know if any of the audience members have questions. We do have a microphone. I'm not sure if we have somebody who's running around with said microphone. Is there a question? Okay, thank you, Stan. If not a question. Oh, we got a question there. Right there. So I think, did we have a question? Oh, Brian, Dr. Brian Peeler has a question there.
Thanks, everyone. This may be more of those academic, this is more of a comment than a question. But to Jim's point about, dialogue between people, I really like that. I want to make sure I remember that when I'm talking to my students. But to go back to what Colin Robertson said at the end, these people aren't these people. Trump is not all that popular. I mean, the numbers are even worse than what you were seeing. He was elected by 2%, but it's his approval ratings like in the mid 30s now, like 57, 63% of people disapprove of what he's doing. These people aren't popular. They're not as popular as they think. And I think, we may not have dialogue with Americans, but Americans aren't so much worried about that because they don't like him either. Dialogue between the two of us will help, but at elite level, I'm not sure that really matters as much. So maybe you want to say something about that. And the other thing is that really what the problem here is the folding of elite institutions to these people. Not, again, this goes to the popularity. These people aren't all that popular. What we have is the folding of elite institutions to their will, right? The firing, the preempting of Jimmy Kimmel indefinitely in response to the ABC merger. I mean, that's what's really going on here. I'm not so sure that we've got a problem with individuals not getting along together as it is just a problem with elite institutions. Again, sorry, that's probably, like I said, more of a comment than a question.
Okay. Thanks. So Colin's a practitioner. The rest of us are academics. Is it up to academics to push back when we see that we aren't happy with the negotiations that are going on, or is that best left to practitioners? And I have a feeling Jim definitely wants to say something.
Jim wants to say something. We'll let him.
Well, I guess if I was in the Trump administration, and just because we don't like the political ideological perspective of the Republican Party under Trump, which is not that distinct from the Republican Party under former Republican leaders, and if you want to go back to Ronald Reagan, you can go back there. And his points about the academic community, which has been raised and hinted at, targeting them, well, I guess the academics should respond to that. But there are multiple sides to the academic community, and how much influence we really have is difficult to know. But I want to say something a little beyond this. Yes, Trump's popularity ratings aren't very good right now. What president, a year or 2, 3 years in office, has really good popularity ratings? You can go back to all of them. They go up, they go down. And there's a variety of reasons. You also have to ask the empirical question, why is those ratings down? Why are people don't like them? You're going to get a variety of different reasons over a variety of different areas relative to the importance individuals attach to certain issue areas. And so it's hard to tell and interpret this. But if we're interested in that, let me remind you, according to Western public opinion polls done in Russia over the past life of President Putin, Putin has been an extremely popular with popularity ratings in the Russian public, which any Western politician would envy to death. Oh, no. The Russian public doesn't have those attitudes. The Russian public is muzzled by the threat of Russian oppression by the government. I don't know the answer to this, but let's not play the popularity number game. We'll see the popularity next October in the congressional election, November, in the congressional elections. We'll see, and how this will then change things. And the final point I want to make, I know this is a little off topic. We have to stop confusing style with substance. If you look back over the life of American administrations, Democrat and Republican presidencies since Franklin Roosevelt, the substance of American policy has really been extremely consistent. It has fluctuated in terms of the emphasis, but the substance issues, and I can point to you multiple examples of the Americans did things which the Europeans didn't like, Canada didn't like, i.e. the Vietnam War, but it was managed because style was the diplomatic protocol of the day. Trump comes along. He is following in a linear path. Tariffs is not new to American administrations at all. They've always been. The Democrats have been the big pro-tariff party, not the Republicans. This is the irony of all of this. What's happened is we are trapped in style. Trump doesn't talk the talk. Okay, he doesn't talk the talk. Does that mean substantively there's really that much uncertainty going on? I don't think so, but the domestic dynamic, because of Trump, because of populism elsewhere, this gets pushed into the public domain and the political domain, which everyone wants to respond to. If Trump goes away tomorrow, how much is really going to change in American policy? I don't think very much at all. So I think we need to take a step back and sort of take a step away. And by the way, we're talking about dialogue, right? Resisting the limits of dialogue. There's a war in the Ukraine. Tens of thousands have been killed on both sides. More, I don't know what the numbers are. And somehow we oppose and condemn the President of the United States sitting down with the President of Putin against popular attitudes to have a dialogue to see if we can find a way to bring this war and this death that's going on to an end. I applaud that. I'm not interested in the Europeans whining and the Canadians whining about this. It was an attempt. Did it work? Appears not. But it's an attempt. Are we supposed to stand aside because we've taken sides and simply let the conflicts run their course? I don't think so. I think all the actors, the key actors, Canada including, needs to engage. But we're not. The Europeans aren't engaging. And there's condemnation of the United States for trying because we don't like Trump. Sorry, I should shut up now.
I think Ursula has a two-finger. Go ahead, Ursula. You just need the microphone.
Just direct, Jim. Do you really think that Trump was trying to set up a dialogue? I always heard something about making a nice, splendid deal. So what's the difference between dialogue and deal? And I think here again, we are back to substance. It's not about alone about style. It's also about what's in there, what they are doing. Is deal making the same thing as dialoguing? Question mark.
I'll just make a quick response to that. Colin gave us the answer to that. Prudence, perseverance, pragmatism, and I can't remember the fourth one.
That was right.
That was right.
Three. Those are the three.
Patience.
And patience. So why don't we believe that? We can't dictate to the Russians unless you want to go to war. I don't think we want to do that. We can't dictate to the Russians, so we can interpret it differently. And I understand your interpretation, and which is the dominant narrative we hear today. But we can look at it. There's some prudence. There's attempt to persevere, and there's some pragmatism about how do we bring this to an end as best as we can to limit the damages that are being done to all sides. And now I'm not saying any more tonight.
Manuel, did you have a comment?
Yes, if I may, it's Jim makes, of course, an appealing argument to get this also into perspective, and there are things that you can line up in support of this argument. But I'm still probably paying a more or being more attuned to the fact that there's something that is not only a quantitative variation of what we had before, but that something qualitatively is happening. And this, I would argue, touches upon the institution of diplomacy itself. So, for example, Donald Trump is offering this highly transactional, highly personalized way of dealing and doing things as the new modus operandi of world politics. And I think all the other nations now have the choice to, okay, are we going to play by these rules, or are we still clinging to these, for some probably now old-fashioned or no longer effective or whatever rules? But I think this is exactly the point of diplomacy, where then style merges, if you like, into substance. Because I would say, realistically speaking, or interest-oriented, I think that the European states and Canada as well would lose in their position and in their bargaining power towards the United States, and whoever would employ this kind of rationale of being transactional and that's it. Talking about values, interests, and these kind of things is something that is also something for the negotiation table. This is part of the identity, should be, of good negotiators. And at the same time, it is something that can be used strategically. This is something probably that is at stake, because if you look at how Donald Trump changed the party politics of the Republican Party by establishing a rule of the game that he was a master in, and that was taken over by all of the other actors in the party. Next stop was the political system of the US itself. He was then applying the rules of the game that he plays very well to this kind of game, and all the others had to fall in line. And I think the European visit to the White House and all the other things reminds me of that we are probably in the shift of style that maybe also a shift of substance could imply, and where many things are at stake. Because in diplomacy, last thought, what you take away from these constitutive elements and rules of the game, you cannot easily pull back the next day. If you destroy trust, if you also destroy the likeliness of states to follow an American hegemony in international relations, because states and peoples ascribe to a leadership position of the US, I think we can witness that this is a worldwide trend, that people in the long term are saying, well, we're not so sure about that anymore. So there is already something happening. So not only would some things remain in place even if Trump would go, but he also has changed so many things that probably are very difficult to reestablish.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions, but I think, Stefan, you had a two-finger.
Just briefly, I mean, if we talk about trust, I think here, I mean, what we haven't talked about, and we're at least, I mean, obviously part of the podium things in a way, there is a fundamental change in through the current US politics, is the fact, I mean, if we look at truth, I mean, there's clearly, I mean, it's, as Manuel said before, in a way, it's about show, it's not about truth. There's no kind of agreement. Actually, the Ronald Reagan kind of administration, I mean, yes, it had obviously completely different values than potentially kind of other or later kind of democratic governments, but they were still all on a level of kind of pragmatic communication. They could agree on certain truth values. There was no question about kind of the kind of advancement of medical science, or that there is something like science, and then we can agree on certain value systems. And I think there we are in a way, and the point is, if it's all on show, then it comes to what Colin and what Manuel said, then obviously there can be no trust. because you can switch it on a dime. You can change your performance, and you do that all the time. And that's why I think the negotiations in Alaska are definitely not, at least not dialogue in the form like we would understand kind of diplomacy. And you can see that in other reactions. So I just wanted to add one thought here, just as a thought for the podium. So if we think about the reactions, I mean, clearly Canada is not quite as polarized in its society as the United States, but fairly close to it. The whole Donald Trump kind of developments of the last year or so made Canada, at least on a certain level, surprisingly united, so that a prime minister like Mark Carney can appear like he is a pragmatist, prudent, and so on, which was a policy that wasn't even thinkable before, because we had it to pure polarization between people. The same thing in India, in a way, if we assume, I mean, obviously it completely backfired, the deal making, in making the nation more proud. And that's kind of, whatever you think of it, what happens there then politically, it makes a difference. So I think it would be an interesting thought to think, is this form of policy style, what is it doing to the populace of other people? So are we possibly able to overcome this our kind of ideological divide that is there in Canadian society too, because out of the sudden we have this kind of enemy structure, and in India I think it would work probably the same way. So again, I think we can't discuss diplomacy without coming back to the effect on the people. So.
Okay, how about what I suggest, because we have a couple of questions, we'll take the questions in sort of omnibus fashion, and then we'll go down the line so everybody can pick and choose which question they feel best they can answer. So can I have the microphone? I saw a hand up there, and I saw a hand up there and there. So we'll take those three questions. So please state your question, and then we'll do the final down the row. So if we could start over there.
I think I have the mics. I'll try.
Oh, so you have a question as well?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So we have 4 questions. So go ahead. Please ask your question.
Well, okay. So I was going to bring up a couple of items. I'll try to be quick. It seems to me that, I mean, when you had a mutual trust created by the deterrence of the NATO and, let's say, what we call the BRICS alliance countries, but mostly Russia, because one would nuke the other. So it was pragmatic to have diplomacy around that, because they both had something to lose. I'm not so sure that having something common to lose is as clear to me now, unless it's economic. And I think there's a lot of economic problems in Russia and China that may become, a valuable tool in negotiation. But that aside, I would say that there's 2 other things that I'd like to say. One is, people stop talking to each other, because I think the rise of cancel culture, and that's not going to go away, and that needs to be addressed, especially with social media and AI, and how we develop a culture of communication which has fallen apart. So that's one thing. So the last thing has to do, which is what I cannot remember, and I'll bring it up later so somebody else can ask the questions.
Okay, thanks. Can we take the microphone over there, please? There we go.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on some of the remarks. And first of all, thank you for your amazing presentation, and for all of you for your contributions to this important discussion. I think, following up on what Ursula said a few minutes ago, I don't think this is really a situation of style. We can look at how Trump and his administration are literally redecorating the White House and putting a lot of the gilt gold, talking about building a new ballroom. That's style to me. Substance, and the reason I think that there's lack of trust now among nations, is because the very foundations upon which this dialogue should be based, international law principles, rule of law, and speaking as a lawyer who practiced for 36 years here and then recently retired, went off to the Netherlands, just got back with my master's in public international law. I'm now steeped in that world of public international law. And I think what's happened is that dialogue, if you can call it that, is taking place in a room where there's no longer a floor. Never mind the carpet that he's laid down there. It's quicksand. People don't know where they stand, and they're sinking because the foundation of international law has been eroded and is continually being eroded. And we can talk about having a seat at the table, but if that table is sitting in quicksand, I don't want to be sitting at that table. We need to be back to international law and principles, talking to Trump privately in a car. Is that really dialogue at looking at peace? Not in my view. Peace would be following international law. How do you talk about peace without talking, for example, about the return of 20,000 kidnapped children, which I argued in my thesis is genocide under the Genocide Convention, forcible transfer of children? How do you talk about peace without talking about ending what is, in effect, an ongoing genocide? Because when the bombs stop, if there's a ceasefire, as we all know, genocides can happen in times of peace and in times of war. So the genocide is continuing. Even if there's a ceasefire, even if the war ends tomorrow, those children have not been repatriated. It's an ongoing genocide. How do we ignore that? State responsibility, the duty to prevent genocide. So I really think that we are at a stage where, yes, diplomacy, discussion, but I found it so important sometimes and powerful at the United Nations when people decide to leave a room when somebody's talking. Sometimes dialogue is also, it's listening. It's also sometimes choosing not to listen, because then you say, I will have dialogue with you at a certain point, maybe when there's not quicksand that I'm standing on. Let's go into this room where there's the foundational principles of international law. Then we can have that discussion. Couldn't have it with you in that room when there was quicksand.
Thank you. If we could run it over there, we've got these last two questions, and then we'll go down the line here.
Hi. I was wondering, we're talking about dialogue, but dialogue with who? And so my question is, we're also looking at Canadian rights. And so while fighting against American imperialism and stuff, even within Canada, we're starting to make compromises that are trampling the grass. And the proverb of elephants fight, the grass is trampled. So with like Bill C-5 and stuff, we're starting to already take away rights of Indigenous people and environmental rights. So how do we ensure that we remain sovereign, but also make sure that that dialogue has spaces for minorities and like future people's rights as well?
Thank you. And then finally, there we go, right in the front there. You had a question?
Thank you. I'd like one of you or all of you to address the style that Trump has of organized crime and the problem of international organized crime affecting everything. He's an outlaw, as long with Putin. And you don't have to be too swift to see how it's impacting every level of society, and that it's cool to be crook nowadays.
Okay, so we had a comment about if you want to, the commonality of losing something must be economic. Is there now no floor to international law? When it comes to diplomacy in dialogue, is, for example, leaving a room part of that process? The question of dialogue with whom do we need to have at the table? It speaks to the diversity issue. And then finally, how do you negotiate or have dialogue when you perceive that the individuals are in fact criminals and we don't have a situation of trust? So Ursula, I'm going to put you on the hot seat. So each of you can pick or choose which you would like to address or comment on, and then we'll finalize with Jim. So Ursula, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, first of all, for all the questions and comments. I'd like to start with the first question, and one element of your question that I noted down, and that was the culture of communication. Because this is really something that also strikes me if we look at how we communicate. And we already mentioned that in some of our comments here. I'd like to add another observation at this point here. Dealing with misinformation, with disinformation in a strategic way. This is something we see in political situations shaped by populism and populist culture. We see this in Europe, we see this partly in Canada, we see this, you know, very clearly in the United States. And a colleague of mine from American Cultural Studies, he added another political strategy in one of his papers that he produced. And he said, what we have on top of, you know, working politically with fake news, with misinformation, we have the political strategy of bullshitting, which is the style of communication that is really dangerous, because that's his argument. If you are confronted in a communicative situation with somebody who's just bullshitting, and this person does it like for 10 minutes, you need at least 30 minutes to you know, correct this kind of bullshitting, and you have had no chance to come along with your own arguments at this time. So this is really a problem of communication, and maybe we as academics should think more about, you know, how can we, you know, get there? How can we, you know, address this? What are our strategies and tactics in coming along with this? I really like this metaphor of the quicksand. This is exactly what we've been talking about with losing, you know, the norm-based, rules-based international system, the protocols, the routines of the diplomatic dialogue. And I leave it with this because we have many other persons here sitting and having, you know, other observations than I do. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, just briefly, I talk about the dialogue with minorities. I think that's absolutely important. That was what I meant in a way when I talk about that we obviously have to watch whatever we are doing strategically in kind of diplomacy, that we have to watch about our own kind of morals or the values, or how we can negotiate values in our own society. I think for all parties involved in a way, it's maybe it is a tricky thing, and maybe it only works if people make compromises and go slightly away from extremes. But I think it is an absolute important thing, and I think for the Canadian society, it's crucial to make a stand who we are as a Canadian society, who want to be together. And some things, you shouldn't. There needs to be a way of preventing that foreign policy basically dictates completely what value systems you are implying in society. So I think, yes, absolutely, you can't leave that out. I wanted to make one more argument slightly closer to what I do my own research on. In a way, how do you make people, again, not polarizing, thinking about things? And one of the elements in museums you would try to do in a way is kind of, okay, the negative model would be, okay, we all know about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a bad thing. We clearly have no issue of creating a clear moral kind of assumption who was good and bad. But the really interesting thing, if we put, from a memory perspective, if we put ourselves in that, or if we put a museum visitor in it, is making museum visitors, and that would be in extension the populace of a country, starting to think what it means to have certain values. Then, without saying, it doesn't matter whether you call it fascism or not, in a way, it's enough to understand that, in a way, certain forms of othering of people, of kind of insisting on your own value system, lead to certain behaviors, which we can see in the development of Nazi Germany and of the Holocaust. And that, in a way, if people feel much more personal how they deal with other people. So that is something we can do in education, we can do it in public memory or memory institutions, and we have to do it in society, in journalism, etc. So I think that is an important thing, and I don't think we will be completely successful in the policies we discussed here, although I agree with all of the general strategies, unless we also work on this form of communication in society.
Thank you. Manuel?
Well, thank you. The communication and the social media was mentioned. The differences in how international affairs are being conducted is obviously also something that adds up to all of these changes. And this brings me to connecting some of the pertinent questions. to these constitutive elements of diplomacy that, in my view, are probably under challenge, and we should be very careful to keep an eye on them and not let them be lost in the daily dealings of international relations. So what I would illustrate is talking about the guardrails that you mentioned in international law. And by the way, also rules that I wouldn't declare to be liberal or Western. These were universal rules that were applied in different parts of the world at different times in different settings. But in 1945, the states present then, coming also from different philosophical traditions and things like that, they said, okay, no matter what differences we will have, and we are certainly going to have major differences, we need to have these basic rules that in Europe were formulated already in 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia. Reciprocity. What I would like to see as behavior against me as a sovereign state, I would also attribute to you as a right to be used. We also had confidentiality in the way of saying that diplomacy is not the way where condemnation or a public attack is the usual modus operandi, but this is a century-old wisdom that you have to cool your temper in order to get to the table and remain at the table and probably get to certain solutions. And I would applaud, as probably Jim does as well, Donald Trump for disrupting certain things that objectively political leaders worldwide didn't get or didn't have any solutions over a long period of time, probably because the problem is very complicated. But disruptive politics opens up opportunities. And you can step in and you can take advantage, and you probably can reverse course of decades-long things that were blocked. But diplomacy then would mean you have a scarce resource, a high-level meeting with the US president. You cannot do this every week because diplomacy doesn't work that way. So if you use disruptive ways of, I'm going to do this, I'm going to talk to this guy, you need to follow through. Otherwise, you are burning the capital of diplomatic relations. And you're also, by the way, you are harming your own diplomatic standing, which probably also we have seen partly. So once again, and thank you for the questions, because I think we are coming back to these constitutive elements of diplomacy that, by the way, are also connected to human communication at large. This is something that you can trace throughout the ages. And I would not say that this is something that we were lucky to have for the past 80 years or so, but now it's a different world. And this is my pessimistic optimism. The problems will remain there, and they will call for the reenactment, re-establishment, and probably rescue of some of these basic rules. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Colin.
And well, I think that's right. I think that we'll have to somehow get back to the basic rules. I couldn't help thinking as I was listening to all of this, the great phrase, the crooked timber of humanity, which I think is Immanuel Kant and Isaiah Berlin used to talk about it in terms of democracy. And I think I think we're going through a very bad patch. I do think it's complicated by social media and technology that we've never had to deal with before. Really, not since the printing press and then television and radio, but this is something new because there's no rules, there's no guidelines. There were always we put in norms at some point on on media, but this doesn't exist today. And so we get this big divergence, and you can live in your own echo chamber. And I don't know how that all comes out, but what I do believe, and I come back to the principles I sort of talk about in terms of diplomacy, I do think that pragmatism is vital. I think prudence is really important, but I do think from a Canadian perspective, perseverance, which is linked to patience, for diplomacy is absolutely valid. You've got to stay. We talk about the Russians. Well, there's things we can talk to the Russians about in the Arctic. We can talk with the Chinese about pandemics, and we still have things in common. What you do not want to see is a breakdown in, as we were saying, communications, the leaving the room part. I think that's a mistake, leaving the room. I understand why you may temporarily do it, but I think you've got to stay in the ring as long as you can, and with the hope of eventually, and you may change the players in the room to find things. And I also think when you run up against the Trumps of the world, that how you persevere, you just stay with it, because I do think that the pendulum will swing. I talked to my American friends, and I heard some of you say, well, we're not going to the States. I think that's a mistake. I think we, of all people, have to engage with our American counterparts, because in fact, there's many reasons why people voted for Trump. Partly, some cases, it was not that they loved Trump, it's just they thought the alternative was worse. And again, it was a 1% difference. And as I think was pointed out by the Trump's popularity is not that high. So I think you have to stick with it. And you have to stick with it particularly if you're a middle power, or a middle power like Canada, because what's your alternative? You cash in your chips and things. So I say, no, that doesn't work. We're still in the game, and let's keep remembering to ourselves that, yes, Trump has taken tariffs against us, yes, but most of our goods are still going through tariff-free because Trump has kept the Canada-US-Mexico, as we call it, or USMACA, in place. Same with Mexico. Why? Because it serves his interests. He knows that the backlash from American people, if you cut off, we were between the two of us, we count for about a third of American trade, Mexico and Canada, and he's already hearing from business people. And I think we stick it through, and patience over time. The big auto companies don't want to cease their operations in Canada. To restart in America is going to cost them a fortune, and there's no guarantees that, we're their biggest market outside the United States. Well, are we going to buy American cars if there's not any production in Canada? No. So I do think that there is a law of physics, and it applies to political gravity. There's a political gravity as well. So that's what I take hope in. But I realize we're going through a difficult time, and again, I don't pretend to know how this ends. I hope it ends well, because that's what humanity bluntly wants, that crooked timber. And when people have a choice, they prefer liberty and freedom. That's what I've observed around the world. And yes, we may not have everybody favoring the United States or the West right now, but generally, they do want the kind of liberties that exist in our countries, and that's why they're all migrating to Germany knows this when they took in 1 million people. Yes, it was hard, and yes, it didn't necessarily work out that people wanted, but it was the right thing to do, I think.
Thanks, Colin. And final word to Jim before I turn it over to Stan.
Before you hit me? Very quickly, we're going to be talking about this stuff in the first panel tomorrow morning. So if you want to come, we'll continue, I think, a lot of this conversation. Very quickly, to your question about the Trump administration, international drug cartels, I would suggest to you, I'm not an expert on this. I read the media, and I'm always sensitive for the media because my own experience with them is probably half the time they get it wrong, but that's just me. I would suggest to you the Trump administration witnessed the last 2 weeks 2 drug supposed speedboats have been sunk by the U.S. Navy under the authority of the President of the United States. And you look at their domestic policy, despite issues about civil liberties in the United States, and those things are going to the courts, this administration has been the first administration in a long time to really take international drug issues and the drug problem very seriously. It's a cornerstone of the administration and the Republican position. So I would suggest we're good. And I don't know, again, what this, I'm not an international lawyer. We should get Dr. Peeler up here. He does this stuff. And so close your ears. You don't want to hear what I'm going to say about international law. Yeah, you do. Well, what I would say very quickly is I am not surprised, but clearly, and this goes back to the use of weaponization, international law has been weaponized by the West to bash those states and leaders who they don't like for whatever reasons. There's this sense, and I'll give you one example, the extraterritorial actions of the International Criminal Court, which is, in my view, a violation of the rules of the international order. So the international law is in trouble when someone doesn't do what we think they should do according to our interpretation of the rules. Now, we could go on I could go a long time to tell you how many times, and the Chinese and the Russians point their fingers at us, we don't report it, how many times the United States has unilaterally violated the rules of the international order which they established. So we have to be very careful about this international argument. I don't think it's a problem, because if we want to go back to the fundamentals, the debate about the rules-based order is not really about a rules-based order. It's about which rules take over priority over which rules under whose interpretation by sovereign states. I don't think there's a quicksand here at all. No more, no less than there's always been a quicksand. So my final thing is, and I guess this is the problem I have. We have become dominated in the West for too long by a certain narrative, which we talk about open to debate, but is really not open to debate. It has become so dominant in the West, a perspective about values and beliefs, and the transference of those on a universal basis. Everyone should be like us. Everyone wants to be like us, and I understand that. God knows in some countries in the world, if I was there, I'd want to be like us and come here as well. I understand that. But what happened to the understanding that emerged in the academic world, which had some resonance for a long period of time, which seems now to have disappeared, which is part of our interpretation of polarization, social media, etc. What happened to the recognition that different cultures have different values, see the world differently, and think differently about things, and interpret the world differently? And how in the world of dialogue, how do these clashing, neither is right, neither is wrong per se, arguably, how do you have dialogue with them? And how do you find that middle ground without trying to create an environment where you're trying to tell them, oh, just listen to me because I know better. Talk to Africa, the African states. Talk to the developing world, or whatever we call the South now. That's a complaint they've made for decades, and we do not listen. We turn it off. So I'm sure I'll be losing my Canadian citizenship in about a day or so, but nonetheless, I think dialogue is important. I think it's vitally important, but we need to start to get out of our own blinders, which drive us on certain paths and certain perceptions, and be more wide open and critical about ourselves before pointing fingers.
Thank you very much. So Stan, did you have a final word before we
No, I think everybody's ready
Yeah.
to go home. However, I think we owe them gratitude and thank you. Thank you for your moral courage. Thank you for your voices. And so I'll end with an apology. My apology is that, yes, we have some snacks, but conversations like this, we need beer. Or we need whiskey, and we don't have that. But nevertheless, fill yourselves with spirit of goodwill. Thank you, and you'll stick around for more questions, I'm sure, in the group. Thank you all for coming.